The salary of Xolile George, Secretary to Parliament of South Africa, has sparked a national debate about transparency and the use of public money. George now earns a staggering package of around 4.9 million rand a year, significantly higher than the president's salary. Parliament says the increase followed a lawful benchmarking process and that the Auditor-General found no irregularities. But the issue has raised broader questions about fairness, accountability, and whether the process meets public expectations. For more on this, we're joined by acting co-chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Parliament Finance, Cameron Dugmore. Mr. Dugmore, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us. So let's start with a basic question. Many South Africans are asking, how does a post advertised at around 2.6 million rand end up with a package of 4.9 million rand, almost double?
Thanks very much. I think the first thing to clarify is that the salary was set eventually after the benchmarking process at 4.4. So maybe at some point you would want to explain, your assertion that it's 4.9. But just to say the key reason for the post being advertised at 2.6 and then eventually through a benchmarking process being 4.4 was the fact that, and this has been what hasn't come through in the media, that at all times there was a process, and this was confirmed when the executive authority presented to our committee on Thursday this week, that the post of the Secretary to Parliament was advertised, but at the same time there was a benchmarking process by an independent organization that has worked with Parliament, from 2007 and at different stages. And that benchmarking process, by looking at the complexity of the work, the legislation that guides this particular position, the fact that the Secretary to Parliament would also oversee the reconstruction of Parliament. Parliament has relationships with different parliaments across the globe, etc. And as a result of that benchmarking process, which ran parallel to the appointment process, the executive authority then, in the sixth administration, accepted the proposal of 4.4. So, there's been a lot of speculation in the media that the Secretary to Parliament increased his own salary. And in fact, the Auditor-General of South Africa audited this entire process and presented a report which went to Parliament indicating that there were no irregularities in this process. So I think the fundamental issue here is that the post was advertised. Parallel to that was a benchmarking process. Everyone understood that that benchmarking process would inform the eventual salary. And that's what happened. It's above board. It's been audited by the Auditor-General. And we received that report at the Portfolio Committee, and we've accepted that explanation. And we've actually then decided that this matter, which in fact is a legacy matter from the sixth Parliament, has now been discussed, it has now been resolved, and that we should move forward.
Mr. Dugmore, this process of benchmarking, was it just focused purely on the Secretary to Parliament's salary, or was it other salaries of individuals within Parliament?
Yeah, no, it was specifically around the Secretary to Parliament's salary. The last time that benchmarking had been done was around 2007. So when Parliament advertised this post, the Human Resources, Human Capital section made it clear to the interview panel and that the salary advertised of between 2.4 and 2.6 would run alongside a benchmarking process. So it was specifically for the STP, given the complexities of this particular role as the senior official in Parliament, responsible for both the National Council of Provinces as well as the National Assembly. So that benchmarking process was then linked to the process of appointment. And it was clear that that benchmarking process would eventually lead to the determination of that particular salary.
Is it standard process to benchmark just for one individual in an institution that has, I'd imagine several hundred people?
Well, the benchmarking processes, can happen in regard to the institution as a whole. or in this regard in regard to a particular position. Now, the Secretary to Parliament position clearly, like managers of parastatals or managers of municipalities, is a particular position with a particular, as I've indicated before, set of responsibilities and complexities. So it's not necessarily unusual that it was conducted, and it had nothing, there's this perception in the public media that Mr. George himself had something to do with the benchmarking process and the company appointed. Now, this particular company had done previous processes in 2007 and over the years. So that particular company had been appointed previously by previous executive authorities and by the executive authorities in the sixth administration. So it's simply not true, as some articles in the media have said, that the STP somehow appointed this benchmarking company to do the work. That's not true. And I think the important thing here is that if we respect the Office of the Auditor-General, and the Auditor-General has conducted a process around the advertising, the benchmarking process, the subsequent adjustment of the salary, that, and that report has been tabled in Parliament and been accepted, what is actually the motivation behind, the ongoing attempt to discredit the Secretary to Parliament and actually try and create an impression that there was something wrong with the parliamentary process? The Auditor-General is a respected authority. That report has been done, and that's why the Parliamentary Committee on Oversight of Financial Matters of Parliament resolved at its meeting to accept the explanation and to accept the report.
Now, just final question on this benchmarking exercise. One of the reasons that it's created so much controversy, I suppose, is because the margin of increase, the advertised salary versus what was then finally agreed upon, and obviously the timelines between the last benchmark and the time that this one occurred. Has it now been agreed by Parliament that these exercises will occur more frequently to avoid, obviously, this vast discrepancies that we are seeing?
Yeah, well, I think when one, uses the phrase of a vast discrepancy, I think one thing we should note was that the Secretary to Parliament, which had been, previously appointed, and when they left that position, was at 3.2 million, and there had last been a benchmarking process in 2007. So so obviously when you're trying to attract someone, from both the public sector and possibly the private sector to head up the institution of Parliament, there are technical specialists, human capital specialists who benchmark, who compare what are people earning that are leading municipalities, what are people earning that are leading departments or parastatals. And for instance, what is quite ironic in this situation is that the main proponents, trying to imply that there was an unlawful, irregular process, were Democratic Alliance members, of the committee. And in the city of Cape Town, the municipal manager of the city of Cape Town receives a salary of 4.5 million. So, when you look at that being a local authority, they've got particular budgets and staff to manage, and you look at Parliament, obviously I think everyone would agree that our country does face an issue of salary gaps between the lowest paid and the highest paid. But there's also a question that when you want your parastatals to be run effectively, you're also trying to seek out the best that we have to do a particular task. And that process was conducted by human capital specialists who do these benchmarking exercises. The Auditor-General found there was nothing wrong with that process. And if you look at other parastatals, for instance, and just to mention a few of those examples, I've mentioned the City of Cape Town, the SABC Group CEO, 5.7, the Auditor-General, 7 million, the Stars Commissioner, 8 million. So there can be a debate around all of those benchmarking processes, but for the head official of Parliament, out of a benchmarked process by human capital professionals, came out with this figure. And I think in that regard, we should then, given that it's been audited, the process was held to be fair, and that there was no irregular process followed. At some point, we need to accept that is the process that was followed, And that's why, in fact, we as a parliamentary committee on Thursday, having received these explanations, then accepted the Auditor-General's finding that this process was not irregular and that the salary had been then set at 4.4 million. The position is there for 5 years, and I think it would be important that Parliament conducts a benchmarking process, not just for the Secretary, but for other officials in Parliament. For instance, the Secretary who runs the NCOP, the Secretary who runs the National Assembly, and other officials. And that, that process gets handled in a transparent way. But I think what's important is that the Auditor-General has confirmed the legitimacy of this process, and that those who still want to raise this particular problem, have an avenue of going to court. But we cannot continually question the integrity of the Secretary to Parliament and create the impression that it was he who awarded himself a salary. That simply doesn't bear with the facts, which have now been presented to the committee in Parliament responsible for oversight on financial matters affecting Parliament.
Yeah, Mr. Dugmore, I suppose part of that acceptance stems from this process of interrogation, where people ask questions and these reports are given. I have to go to my final question. Now, for viewers who may not fully understand the office, what exactly does a Secretary to Parliament do, and why is this role considered so important?
Well, firstly, there's legislation which governs the financial issues related to the running of Parliament, the issues of preparing strategic plans, accounting for money spent. And that Financial Management Act that covers Parliament and the provincial legislatures, the accounting officer there is the Secretary to Parliament. So first of all, the Secretary to Parliament has to take responsibility for preparing budgets and then accounting on a quarterly basis, and also presenting the annual financial statement. So there's a financial accountability. Secondly, the Secretary to Parliament has to oversee the work of both the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces, which make up Parliament. The preparation of 5-year strategic plans. An additional responsibility now, which has emerged, is to oversee the Development Bank of South Africa, who have been appointed to reconstruct Parliament after Parliament was burnt down in an arson attack. That is the responsibility, overseeing the whole process in regard to temporary accommodation through the Dome. And then also Parliament has relationships with parliaments across the world, in the Commonwealth, in other parliamentary fora. And the Secretary to Parliament is responsible for also making sure that those relationships are there. And I think that if you look at the separation of powers in our country, you've got Parliament, you have led by our Speaker, and then the senior, the Speaker and the Chairperson of the National Council of Provinces, the key official responsible for this sphere of government, the Parliament, is the Secretary to Parliament. So I think the issues of complexity, financial accountability, preparing the annual performance plan, and then accounting for how Parliament spends its money, indicates that this is in the makeup of the South African democracy, of the executive, Parliament, the judiciary. The Secretary to Parliament has a crucial role to play. And I have confidence that the organization, 21st Century, that actually conducted the benchmarking exercise, looked at provincial legislatures, looked at local government and also other spheres of government, has come up with a package that will actually attract the kind of competence that we need to run a complex institution like Parliament. And that is the salary that was then set of 4.4 million, not by Mr. George, but through an independent benchmarking process that Parliament then accepted.
Cameron Dugmore, Acting Co-Chair for Joint Standing Committee on Parliament Finance. Appreciate your time. Thank you so much for speaking to us on that issue around the Secretary of Parliament, Xolile George's earnings of 4.4 million rand, and the Auditor-General, Sakanama Luleke, revealed that post initially advertised and everything above board.